Everyone who's here to start, and then we'll go.
Just on me?
Yeah.
I'm with.
Rob, Peter,
Liz,
Chris,
Marion, Nicola, Anne, Margaret, Diana,
Colin,
Natasha,
Andrew,
Kathy, Priscilla.
And Daniel. So thank you all so much. And Revel, absolutely.
Celebrity guest.
So we're looking to begin with at the ancient history of the Holy Land. So if you could all look at the first figure at the front of the maps. So just for Leslie and Colin's sake, here is a map, of the Levant, the Middle East, going right back to the late Bronze Age. This is all the way back close to 2000 BC. And this is kind of really ignoring the first 11 chapters of Genesis, where the biblical history really begins. Now, those of you who 18 months ago were part of the History of the Bible course, apologies, we'll be kind of going over a lot of what you might have learned already, but hopefully you'll enjoy having a bit of a refresher. So what we see here is Abraham's journey. So Abraham is obviously the foundational figure of all three Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. All three of those religions trace their roots back to Abraham. So Abraham was born in the city of Ur in the Chaldeans, which is where I'm pointing here. So it's near the Persian Gulf. So it's a very, very ancient city, probably about 9,000 years old. It was around long before Babylon ever became an empire of any sort. And we are told that Abraham was born in this city, and then at some point in his life, he was called by God to take a great journey. Now, obviously, Abraham did not grow up believing in the God of the Bible. The Chaldeans, or Babylonians, as we call them today, were a pagan people who worshipped a variety of different deities. And we know from archaeology that in the city of Ur, they worshipped a moon goddess. So Abraham, or whoever the historical figure behind the stories of Abraham is, would have grown up worshipping this moon goddess. I think she's called Nabu. And then he began this great journey. So this foreign god that he'd never heard of before suddenly called him on this great journey. Now, Abraham could have crossed all the way from there to there, from Ur to the land of Canaan, but he didn't. He took this long journey, which is described in the book of Genesis, all the way here first to Haran, and then down to Canaan. Does anyone know why he made that long way around journey the north way?
Desert.
Because of the desert, yeah. So this whole area here is this enormous barren desert, whereas going from here all the way through the rivers Euphrates and Tigris, down the river Jordan, all the way to the Nile, this was a whole ring of green. Does anyone know what that was called in the ancient world? You almost had it.
The Fertile Crescent.
The Fertile Crescent, that's exactly right. So Abraham traveled along the Fertile Crescent. So he began in Ur, traveled to Haran, and eventually made his way down to the land of Canaan, where God was calling him to go to. And it is in the land of Canaan that we now call the Holy Land, where all the Israel-Palestine history begins. And it's believed that a minority of Palestinians living in the Holy Land today can actually trace their ethnic heritage, as we get in, back to the original Canaanites. Hello, Joan.
I'm so sorry I'm late.
Just to have a seat.
Hi.
So some of you might have been at Joan's Icon evening the other night, and can you remember what I told you, if you were there, what the name Canaan actually means?
Is it to do with Cain?
No. The word Canaan means purple. because the people of the land of Canaan were known for producing the color purple from these mollusks that grew there. So it was the only place in the ancient world where the purple dye could be produced. So they're called Canaan, the land of Canaan, Canaan. And the main tribe there were the Canaanites. But there are also other tribes there as well, like the Hittites, the Jebusites, the Perizzites, the Ammonites, Amorites. There's lots of them. So it was a land populated by many different tribes. Huh?
Lots of ice.
Lots of ice, yeah. Marion, if he's going to be annoying, just get me.
No, he's all right.
He's all right, okay. So if you want to turn over to the next page. It's all right. It's just water. It's water. So is everyone with me so far?
Yes.
I do apologise if I'm a bit incoherent. I've got a really bad cold, and I've spent most of the day in bed, but I'm okay. So we have. It is believed that the Israelites came from two different sources. So we have the first source, which is from the north, from Haram, Abraham and all his descendants. So Abraham and his wife Sarah, they had two sons, Ishmael and Isaac. So Arabs are believed to be descended from Ishmael, and then the Israelites are descended from Isaac. Isaac had two sons with Rebekah, Jacob and Esau, that's right, yep. And then Jacob the younger married Rachel and Leah, and with her he had the 12 sons, which you all know from the Andrew Lloyd Webber musical, and that wonderful story. So those stories are originally believed to have come from the north. So the historical basis for them arrived from up there somewhere and then made their way down here. But there were another load of stories that came from the south, from Egypt. Now, here, who's seen The Prince of Egypt, the film?
Yes.
Yep, so you know the story of Moses and the Exodus. That is on this second sheet. So, in the story, in the Bible, the second youngest son, Joseph, is sold into slavery in Egypt because his older brothers are jealous of him. And while he's in Egypt, he rises to prominence. He becomes basically the sort of prime minister or equivalent of the Pharaoh in Egypt, and he rules over the land. And then eventually there's a famine in the land of Canaan. But Egypt is knowing prosperity because of a dream that God warned Pharaoh about. So they've already prepared all their grain in preparation for this famine. And the brothers, the 12 brothers or 11 brothers, they come down from Canaan and ask for help. And then Joseph obviously is disguising himself and not revealing himself to his brothers. But eventually he reunites with his brothers, reveals himself. And the brothers, Jacob and all the sons, come down from Canaan to live in Egypt with Jacob. Now, there are 12 sons of Jacob, and they are the ancestors of the 12 tribes of Israel. Has everyone heard of them, the 12 tribes of Israel? So each of the 12 tribes are descended from one of the sons of Jacob. Now, so all the original Israelites, those sons of Jacob who moved into Egypt, they die, they multiply. These are called the Hebrews now, and they live there for a while until there's another Pharaoh, and he becomes fearful of the Israelites. He thinks they're going to take over Egypt, and so what he does is he forces them all to be slaves, and they are slaves for over 4 centuries. In Ramesses, we are told in the Bible, which is right at the northern part of the River Nile, and it's there they were made to build cities, supply cities. Some people think that the pharaoh at that time might have been Ramesses II, but we don't know for sure. Eventually, a baby is born called Moses, and he's raised up by God as a prophet to deliver the Israelites from slavery in Egypt. You know the story. So they cross the Red Sea and head northward into Canaan. Now, the Bible very cleverly connects those stories together. The Genesis stories of Abraham and his descendants, and the Exodus stories of Moses and all the Israelites in Egypt. But it's believed that originally those two sets of stories were completely distinct from each other. Some from the north, some from the south, and that whoever the Israelites were originally, they didn't just arrive from one particular place. They would have come from the north and the south, and their stories of their ancestors would have kind of joined together. So now we've got the Israelites around sort of 1200 BC living in the land of Canaan. The book of Joshua makes it out as if the Israelites went in there and wiped out all the Canaanites and the Hittites and the Perizzites and the Jebusites, etc. They didn't. There's no evidence of that, and they very clearly kept living alongside all those native tribes in Canaan for a very long time. So that's where we're at the moment. So you've got Israel living in the land of Canaan, and if you turn to the next picture. Am I going too fast, by the way? Okay. Let's make sure this is broadcasting. It is. So when the Israelites arrive in Canaan, they settle into different regions, different allotted areas based on their tribes. So we've got all 12 sons of Jacob and their descendants in their nice little tribes. So Asher, Naphtali, Zebulun, Issachar, Gad, Reuben, Judah, Simeon, Dan, and Benjamin. Now, Joseph, for some reason, there's no tribe of Joseph. Joseph is always split into two half tribes, Manasseh and Ephraim, who were Joseph's sons. And the Levites don't have their own allotted area. Does anyone know why? The Levites. It's the one tribe because they have the priests, yeah. So the Levites, the descendants of Levi, so Moses and his brother Aaron and his sister Miriam, they were descendants of Levi, and they are to be the priests. The priests are not allotted any particular region like the other tribes because they have the immense privilege of serving God in the tabernacle, and they are allowed places and land in all the different tribes. So that for a while was what Israel looked like until sort of the year 1050 BC. Now, we know that Israel definitely existed as some kind of nation by this point. They didn't have a king. They sort of ruled kind of themselves. This is during the book of Judges. The judges were sort of charismatic warlords that arose every so often to help them in a time of crisis. But we do know they existed because an Egyptian, what do you call those gigantic tablets? My brain's going dead. Stele, that's it. Thank you, Colin. A stele was found, which describes one of the Egyptian pharaohs, Amenhotep, invading Israel, it says. And it says that the line was, Israel is laid waste, but his seed is not. Seed meaning not descendants, it did mean like agriculture. So that's the first time Israel kind of enters archaeological history, and that's around sort of 1200 BC. So they did exist as a people back then. So they remained in these allotted tribes for a while, again, living alongside the other tribes. They gradually became the dominant ethnic group in the land of Canaan, so eventually they would have superseded the Canaanites and all the other ones, but there was no kind of genocide like the Bible describes, wiping them all out. That just didn't happen. So if you turn over to the next part, we go now from the time of the Judges, when Israel is this happy little sort of anarchic tribal kind of nation, and it becomes eventually a kingdom. So Saul is anointed king by the prophet Samuel. So the people of Israel, they have this idea in their heads that, oh, we're weak because we don't have a king. We want to be like all the surrounding nations. We want to have our own king who will lead us in battle and unite us. And God is described as being initially quite dismayed about this because it's like, well, hang on, I'm God, I'm your king. You shouldn't need an earthly king. But the people keep persisting anyway, and Samuel is eventually told by God to find a king for them. And this poor sod from the tribe of Benjamin called Saul is chosen to be king. And Saul is a very tragic figure. He's a disastrous king. He clearly has a significant mental illness. He's a very violent man. He makes lots of mistakes, and eventually he's punished for his sins and for all these mistakes. But the poor guy never asked to be king. Anyway, there he is. And if you look on this map, so the little yellow bits, that in the Bible is described as being Saul's kingdom. So very small. So Saul only kind of governed a small part of the whole area of Israel. But eventually Saul dies in battle along with his son Jonathan. And then who does Samuel anoint king next? David. So David is of the tribe of Judah. So Saul was of the tribe of Benjamin, David is of the tribe of Judah, and then Moses was of the tribe of Levi. So all these kind of characters from the Bible, they're of different tribes. And David is the youngest of many sons. It's always kind of the youngest sons in the Bible that get the kind of the promise and the power. It's a recurring theme all throughout the Bible. And David is a very righteous man. He greatly expands this kingdom of Israel. So all of it you see in green. They are David's conquests, his kingdoms, which are described in wonderful detail in the books of Samuel. In the Bible, it's my favorite part of the whole Bible, the books of Samuel. I love those stories. And then eventually David dies, and his son Solomon becomes an even greater king. And Solomon expands the kingdom even further, especially to the north, which is shown in this map too. So this time period is normally called by historians the United Monarchy, so the time when all the tribes of Israel were united under one king. First Saul, then David, then Solomon. And this is around 1000 BC. Is everyone still with me? Yeah, I hope I'm not going too fast. And it's also this time, what is Solomon most significantly remembered for doing? What does he do during his reign? He builds the first temple in the city of Jerusalem. It's worth mentioning at this point that when David first became king, his capital city was not Jerusalem, it was Hebron. So everyone heard of Hebron? Today it's a very significant holy city in the West Bank. The reason it's a very holy city is because it has inside of it the oldest archaeological site of the Abrahamic religions. It has the tombs of the patriarchs and the matriarchs. So the book of Genesis describes that Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Rebecca, Jacob, and Leah, but not Rachel because she was buried at Bethlehem, are all buried in Hebron. And they know where the site is. It's always been a site of pilgrimage for thousands of years. And there's a mosque built over it. It's called the Ibrahim Mosque. It's a ghastly mosque. Me and my fellow pilgrims went into it one time, and all the women, as non-Muslim women, were forced to wear these sort of handmade tail hoods and cloaks and everything. And it wasn't a particularly nice environment. But anyway, we saw the tombs. It was interesting. And that was originally the kind of the center point of the Israelites when they first conquered the land of Canaan, because that was the site where the tombs were buried. But a few years into his reign, David, and it doesn't explain anywhere in the Bible why he does this. There's no command from God that tells him to go and conquer Jerusalem, make it the capital. It just says for the first 7 years of his reign, David was king at the capital of Hebron, and then for the next 33 years of his reign, he was king of Jerusalem. David did not build Jerusalem. Jerusalem is a very ancient city. It was there long before the Israelites arrived. The city itself is, I think, 7,000 years old. It was originally called Salem. Salem, again, is a pagan goddess. Jerusalem is city of Salem, which is the goddess. We don't really know much about the really ancient history of Jerusalem, other than by the time David came, it was inhabited by the Jebusites, one of the tribes that lived there. But David expelled the Jebusites from Jerusalem and made that his capital. He built his palace there. He wanted to build a temple for God, because at that time God was still living in the Ark of the Covenant, we're told. But God said to David, no, you're not allowed to build the temple, because, does anyone know why David wasn't? Not Bathsheba, no. The reason was David had shed too much blood. Because David had invaded a lot of places and won many battles and killed thousands of people. And God said, although God loved David, he said to him, no, you can't build my temple because you've got too much blood on your hands. So Solomon is the one to build the temple. And it's this great temple. And the ark is put in the Holy of Holies inside the temple in Jerusalem. And Solomon starts out as a very good king. Sadly, he continues his reign and doesn't become a very good king. He marries hundreds of different women. He has about 300 wives and 700 concubines. Most of them are women from the surrounding nations who believe in different gods, and they entice Solomon to worship and sacrifice to their gods. And so Solomon becomes more and more unfaithful, and his sin, we're told, is the reason why all the ensuing disasters in the kingdom of Israel happen. So if you want to turn over to the next page, this one. Is everyone still with me? I really hope you are. Is it all right?
Amazingly fast potted history.
Okay. It's very, very fast tracking through the history of Israel. So the map on your left is the largest extent of the United Kingdom of Israel under Solomon. And then after Solomon dies, it all goes disastrously wrong. His son Rehoboam is not accepted as king by the 10 northern tribes. It's only the tribe of Judah and also Simeon, because the Simeon tribe is within the boundaries of the Judah tribe, that continues to acknowledge the Davidic line. So it becomes two kingdoms at that point, the southern kingdom of Judah and the northern kingdom, which is still called Israel, which is quite confusing. So from that point onwards, there are two kingdoms. And this is where we get into the books of Kings in the Bible, which is very, very historical. So whereas the earliest books of the Bible, it can't be proved what's historical and what's not. As the story progresses throughout Scripture, more and more of it becomes verifiable by archaeology. And when the books of Kings mentions the kings of Judah and the kings of Israel, so for example, Hezekiah, Asa, Josiah, these people definitely existed. We have lots of archaeological evidence of coins from their reign and things like that. So we know that there was definitely two Iron Age kingdoms, the kingdom of Israel in the north and the kingdom of Judah in the south. At this point, the Israelite religion was completely predominant over the Holy Land, and the religions of the former Canaanite peoples are gradually diminished less and less. So they were very they didn't do much anymore at this point. So again, all of the book of Joshua makes it out as if Israelites came and saw and conquered and wiped out all the tribes there. They didn't. They lived alongside them originally, and then over time became the dominant group, and all the Canaanites slowly became the smaller groups until they either assimilated into the Jewish nation or left or just sort of fizzled out. That's what we've got so far. Now, you may notice that these two small kingdoms are surrounded on every side by lots of other kingdoms. And the Iron Age was the beginning of a time when there were no longer just kingdoms, but also beginnings of empires as well. So empires were now a new thing in the Middle Eastern civilization, which was very dangerous for all these smaller kingdoms that you see on the map. So we're told in the books of Kings that some of the kings of Judah were righteous and some were not. And they continued to worship in the temple in Jerusalem. So they stayed holy for quite a long time. The northern kingdom of Israel very quickly fell into sin and idolatry, worshipping other gods, practicing pagan rituals, the most horrible being sacrificing children, which was regarded by the Israelites as one of the worst sins you could commit. That was one of the distinctive features of the Israelite people that separated them from the surrounding nations. They did not practice human sacrifice. That was never a part of Israelite belief, whereas it was a huge part of the belief of most of the other surrounding pagan nations. Now, eventually, Israel, we are told, falls into such sin and depravity that eventually their kingdom collapses and they are completely overrun by the Assyrian Empire. So the Assyrian Empire was it wasn't an enormous empire, probably on this map stretched about where I'm pointing there. But it was big enough to conquer the kingdom of Israel. So Samaria, which was the capital of the kingdom of Israel, was conquered by the Assyrian Empire 2 BC. And many of the Israelites living in the kingdom of Israel, the northern kingdom, were taken into exile back to Assyria and their other regions. The kingdom of Judah lasts for a while longer. It's astonishing, actually, historians say, how long Judah did manage to last for afterwards, because look at Judah, it's a tiny, tiny kingdom. It's about the size of North Yorkshire. It's very small. And yet no empire, not Egypt, not Assyria, not Edom or Moab, conquered it during that time. So that kind of gives support to the biblical idea that God was still protecting this nation because they were still faithful and holy and everything. But eventually, even the kingdom of Judah began to fall into sin and depravity, following after the practices of the pagan nations around them, until eventually the same fate befalls them. In 587 BC, they are invaded and conquered by the Babylonian Empire, which is even bigger. So the Assyrian Empire by that point has fallen. It's been taken over by the Babylonian Empire. So if you look on the next map, that huge band of green is the Babylonian Empire. So they completely conquer the whole of the Fertile Crescent. So Babylon has its origins in Ur of the Chaldeans, where Abraham was from. So Babylon is basically it started in what is modern day Iraq, and then made its way all on the Fertile Crescent. So they conquered the Tigris and Euphrates and all the way down to the land of Canaan, so Israel and Judah, and are basically part of Babylon. Babylonians destroy the first temple, completely raze it, and the vast majority of the people in Judah are sent into exile to Babylon, which is circled in red on the map. Babylon was the greatest city in the world at that time. And in the Bible at that point, that's when you've got a lot of the prophets like Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Daniel, bewailing the loss of their nation, the destruction of their temple, everything like that. So this is the beginning of the Israelite people, later known as the Jewish people, being dispersed across the earth. So before this, they were all in one particular location, the Holy Land, a relatively small geographic area. Now they're in Assyria, they're in Babylon. Some of them fled down to Egypt to escape. So Jeremiah, we know, went down to Egypt and died there apparently. And there are very few of them left in the Holy Land in Judea, which is now a very underpopulated, fallen region. The Babylonian Empire only lasts for another 40 years, and then that's eventually overthrown by another empire. Does anyone know which empire that is? The Persian Empire. So the empires get bigger and bigger each time. So what you see on this map here, you see on the top it says the Median Empire, and then Persia. So the Medes and the Persians united to form the Persian Empire. And Darius, this great emperor, he conquered Belshazzar, the son of Nebuchadnezzar, who was the emperor of Babylon. And then you've got the Persian Empire. So turn over again. So the Persian Empire is absolutely huge. It stretched all the way from Europe, from Macedonia, all the way to the Himalayas. And it was the main power in the world for about 200 years. And during this time, so if Babylon was centered in what is today Iraq, Persia, the power is centered in what is today Iran. Yeah, so Iranians are commonly mistaken for Arabs. They are not. Iranians are Persians. They're very different from Arabs. So the Persian Empire ruled over this whole swathe of the earth, even Egypt. So Egypt was conquered by Persia as well. But Persia, thankfully, is actually much nicer than Babylon. The Babylonians forced all of the peoples they conquered to worship their own gods, but the Persian emperors weren't particularly interested in forcing people. Your question, Kathy?
No.
Okay.
Sorry,
If anyone has any questions, by the way, please, I like being interrupted. I hate talking at length. So if anyone has any questions, please interrupt me. Are people still following me, by the way? Is everyone? Yeah, absolutely. This is just next week we'll be going detailed through modern events, and we'll spend more time looking at. I think it's just good to do this. Are people finding it helpful? This broad overview. Okay, good. So the Persian emperors are a lot more kind of magnanimous and benevolent. They say, "Oh yes, we'll rule you, but you're very welcome to worship whatever gods you like." And the Persian emperor at the beginning is Cyrus the Great, or Kurosh, as his name is in Persian. And Kurosh, he very benevolently allows the Judeans, they're now called the Jews at this point. Before this, they were called the Israelites, and now they're called the Judean. The word Jew comes from Judah, the kingdom of Judah, and he allows them to return from Babylon to the land of Canaan, and Judah is established by the Persian emperor as a province within his empire, and he allows them to rebuild the temple. So this is where the second temple is built. And it's amazing, actually, the way that the Israelites, the Judeans, praise Persian emperor. In the book of Isaiah, for instance, but the very later chapters, they call Cyrus almost kind of like God's Messiah. God has sent this anointed one to save us and deliver us from our Babylonian captors and bring us back to our homeland and everything. So Cyrus gets quite a good portrayal in the Bible. Bit of trivia, the religion at that point in the Persian Empire was Zoroastrianism. Has anyone heard of that? Zoroastrianism? It's the oldest religion in the world. That was the religion of the Persians. So Cyrus did not worship the God of Israel. He worshipped, well, they didn't really have one single deity in Zoroastrianism, but he was part of that faith. Persian Empire lasts until the 4th century BC, and then the Persian emperor makes a very terrible mistake. He tries to conquer all of the Greek lands, the Greek city-states. So Greece at that time was not a unified kingdom. It was made up of lots of different city-states. So Athens, Thebes, Corinth, Argos, I'm trying to think what the other ones were. Sparta being the most important, because Persian emperor at that time, Artaxerxes, he tries to invade these city-states, but they repel him, and you probably all heard of the battle of the Spartans at Thermopylae and all that, and they, didn't win, but the Persian emperor did not manage to seize control of the Greek lands, and then his power was pushed back over the Aegean, and then a few decades later, a very powerful king in Macedonia called Philip, he has this ambition to expand his kingdom of Macedonia into Greece, and he conquers all of the Greek city-states because he has this idea that he wants to create his own little empire. So Macedonia is a very small kingdom, where Macedonia is today, and it's been around for about 200 years, and they're culturally Greek, even though they're not Greek themselves. And Philip conquers every single one of the Greek city-states and makes them part of his kingdom. And then Philip is suddenly assassinated. As soon as he conquers all of Greece, he's assassinated. And then his 18-year-old son becomes king. And who is the son? Alexander the Great. So Alexander picks up where his dad left off. And him and all his mates, like Ptolemy and Hephaestion and I can't remember the names of them, but they all decide to follow Alexander on his great conquest. Within a few short years, he conquers all of Asia Minor, so Turkey. A couple more years, he conquers Egypt, and he builds the city of Alexandria. And then a few years after that, he conquers Babylon, and then Medes, and so he basically overthrows the Persian Empire within a few short years. So by the time he was younger than me, and by the time he was about 25, 26, he became the most powerful person on earth. So Alexander is one of those sort of ridiculous historical figures that no one's quite able to fathom. But his charisma and his military strategies, he never lost a single battle, enabled him to create the empire that you see there, which went all the way to the he had this grand plan to conquer the whole world, and within that empire that he conquered was Judah. So Judah just wasn't really violently invaded in any way because it was a small province. Alexander's armies on their way to Egypt just sort of wandered through it and didn't really take much notice of it. But this was a very significant time because Alexander, he had this idea that Greek culture, Hellenistic culture, as we call it, was the sort of peak of human civilization. The Greek culture was the best, and he wanted to enlighten all these so-called barbarian nations, the pagans, by influencing them with Greek culture. So Alexander was obsessed with Homer. The Iliad was his favorite book. He had it always by his bedside wherever he went, and he brought the Greek gods, Greek literature and language to wherever he went, including to Judea. Now, the Jews living in Judea at that time became very heavily influenced by Hellenistic culture, to the extent that they would even have statues in their house, something that had been very much forbidden in Jewish law before that. And many of the Jews living in Judea then decided, actually, we quite like Hellenistic culture because our own, Israelite culture with the law and everything is too stuffy, it's too sort of, racially exclusive or too sort of isolated. So a lot of them then left. So the Jewish diaspora dispersion became even bigger at that point. And there was a very strong militant fundamentalist reaction to this, what was seen as a betrayal of Jewish values in Judea at that time. And this reaction was from a family called the Maccabees. Anyone heard of them? Maccabees. Maccabees were 7 brothers, religious zealots, and freedom fighters who wanted to free their people from the oppression of the Greeks. Now, Alexander, around this time, died. He died very young, in his early 30s. Something he died from malaria, something he was poisoned, we don't really know. But his empire was too big to be kept by one person. So it was divided into 4. So if you go over to the next page, it's basically divided up between all his mates. Parthian in the east, Ptolemaic in Egypt. So his friend Ptolemy became the Egyptian pharaoh. So Ptolemy, we heard of the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt. So the Ptolemaic pharaohs weren't even Egyptian, they were Macedonian, because they were all descended from Ptolemy. But the Judea was in this awkward position where it fell sort of halfway between the Seleucid Empire, which is ruled by the Antiochian kings, and the Ptolemaic Empire. And they were very heavily oppressed on both sides, and there was this huge pressure to conform to Hellenistic culture. And the Maccabees roused the Jewish people and got them to fight against the oppression of the Seleucid Empire. And eventually they succeeded in creating an independent Judean country, which is the bit you see in red. And the Maccabees eventually formed their own kingdom, and that was the beginning of the Hasmonean dynasty. People heard of the Hasmonean dynasty? And that lasted for about 150 years. So it was a time of huge religious fervor in the Holy Land. So this was really the beginning of the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, the charismatic ascetics wandering in the wilderness, prophets, rabbis, things like that. So the context that we're very familiar with in the Gospels, where everyone's interested in all these different religious ideas, and there's all these different groups and stuff in the temple and in the wilderness. Jesus being one of the rabbis at that time, that all kind of begins with the Maccabees. I remember reading something that Christopher Hitchens, the famous atheist, wrote. He said that he regards it as a travesty that the Maccabees won that revolution, because he says that if Greek culture had prevailed in Judea, then we would never have had all the kind of Maccabean religious fervor that would have led to, as he saw it, Christianity and then Islam. So the influence of the Maccabees really can't be sort of overstated. They really had a huge influence on how religion developed in that part of the world.
Daniel,
Yes.
are the Maccabees in the Apocrypha?
They are. So they're in
Maccabees.
the Apocrypha. Yeah, there's 4 books of the Maccabees. One Maccabees is historical. The rest of them are not. So if you read one Maccabees, that will tell you very accurately the story of the Maccabees. And it was written around that time as well, so it's quite contemporary in its account. Is everyone still with me? Yeah, you're doing so well. Gosh, what time am I on? That's all right. So the Hasmonean dynasty continues until the 1st century BC, but another power is rising further to the west, and it will be the greatest empire the world has ever seen. You all know what that is, the Romans. So Rome has been a republic for a few hundred years. Rome has sort of slowly become more powerful, and then eventually this young senator called Julius Gaius Caesar has this idea that he wants to be the sole ruler of Rome. So he forms a triumvirate with two other Roman senators, Pompey Magnus and Marcus Crassus, and he becomes the most powerful elected consul, which is kind of like a president. So they elected their leaders in the Roman Republic ever seen. But then he doesn't give up his power. And he transforms the Roman Republic into the Roman Empire, but he never becomes emperor because he is assassinated on the Ides of March by all the other senators. And the senators try to reinstate the Roman Republic, but unsuccessfully because Julius Caesar has completely transformed the whole infrastructure of Rome so that it's dependent on being a dictatorship, not a democracy. And then there's a brief civil war between Mark Antony and what's he called, Marcus Brutus on one side, and then Julius Caesar's young, his heir, his protege, Augustus.
Pompey?
Huh?
Pompey?
No, Pompey's there by this point. Yeah. Oh, interestingly, Pompey Magnus, who was a friend of Julius Caesar's, but they turned enemies, he fled to Egypt, where he was killed by the young pharaoh at that time, who was a direct descendant of Ptolemy. And then this young pharaoh who killed Pompey was then killed by his sister, who became pharaoh. Who knows what she was called? Cleopatra. Yes, so Cleopatra was the last of the Ptolemaic rulers in Egypt. And she briefly had a fling with Mark Antony, who was another of Julius Caesar's allies. And you all know that story ends. And so eventually Julius's heir, the young Octavian, who becomes Augustus, he becomes the first Roman emperor. He rules for 40 years, so far longer than any other Roman emperor. And he, in a series of conquests, including Judea, which falls under Roman rule again, he brings about what's called the Pax Romana, which is a time of relative international security for the next 120 years. And that's the Roman Empire, at the height of its power. And that is the context into which Jesus Christ is born. So Augustus is emperor when Jesus is born. By the time Jesus is a young man going about Judea and Galilee, preaching and performing miracles, it's Tiberius who is emperor. Tiberius is a pretty rubbish emperor, but Rome is still very strong at that point. And this is when things really start to go awry for the Jewish nation. So wherever the Romans conquer, they allow the people that they conquer to continue to worship their own gods, as long as they worship the Roman emperor as a god as well. But what's the one distinctive thing about the Jews in the provinces of Judea and Galilee that means that they can't follow that rule? What's the distinctive thing about the Jews? They only worship God. So they can't worship as God, and this creates a lot of problems. So Judea and Galilee, for the Romans, are by far the most troublesome provinces. And there's loads of issues from the start, insurrections, riots, things like that, some of which are even mentioned in the Gospels. And this sort of gets worse and worse and worse after Jesus' death and resurrection and the beginnings of the early church, early Christianity. The Roman Empire is brilliant for early Christianity because it means that there's all these very little fast networks and connections and everything, which means that, St. Paul and the other apostles can travel very easily, write letters to each other very easily. So, in this time of great sort of connectedness in the empire, the Christian church blossoms. But back in the Holy Land, in Judea and Galilee, the insurrections get worse and worse until, under the rule of the Emperor Vespasian, he decides that he's had enough. So he sends his heir Titus with an army of 10,000 Roman soldiers to Jerusalem. And what the Roman soldiers do is they begin by sort of peacefully, this is in AD 70, they begin by sort of peacefully surrounding Jerusalem and not doing anything. And they allow all the Jews who are on pilgrimage they deliberately come at the time of Passover. They allow hundreds of thousands of Jews to enter into Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover. And then as soon as the Jews have entered Jerusalem, they then lay siege to the city. So there are hundreds of thousands of Jews stuck in Jerusalem while 10,000 Roman soldiers have surrounded them. And Jerusalem, over the next few months, basically entered into a state of anarchy. There was mass starvation. They were being bombarded from the outside. Thousands of people were crucified on the walls outside of it. So Josephus, the Jewish historian, describes the horror of seeing rows upon rows of crosses everywhere outside Jerusalem. It was a really terrible, terrible time. There was even cannibalism, we're told, inside the city. And eventually the Romans break through the walls and they completely destroy the Second Temple and put in the place of the temple a shrine to the god Jupiter, which is the Roman Zeus, as a mockery to the Jews. And thousands of Jewish people are enslaved and taken away. Really horrible things. Some of them are sold to Roman aristocratic families to be slaves. We're told that some of the kind of, they always did this, that the sort of the more good-looking people, they enslaved and took to be put into the arenas to be killed by lions and to fight each other and things like that. So it was really horrible. Jerusalem was completely sacked and the land was left in ruins. And the Jewish presence was mainly consolidated after that point in Galilee, which is the northern province where Jesus grew up. So Judea was effectively kind of non-existent anymore, and Galilee became the main place where, I don't know why I'm looking at that, it's not actually shown on there. So the Sea of Galilee's there a little bit, and that's the Dead Sea. So Galilee's up here, Judea was down there. One thing I forgot to mention, of course, was after Rome took over Judea and Galilee, they got rid of the Hasmonean dynasty and they put another dynasty of kings in place. What were they called? The Herodians. So the Herodians were not actually Jews. So Herod tried to convince everyone that he was king of the Jews, but he wasn't. He was from Edom. He was an Idumean. He was half, so he had some Jewish blood in him, but he wasn't really a Jew. So that's why he was kind of hated by the Jewish people. So the Jewish people are significantly depleted by this point in this land. Most of them are sent into a diaspora all across the Roman Empire. There's a final insurrection in 130 AD, which is called the Bar Kokhba revolt. Bar Kokhba is Hebrew for son of the star. So a young man called son of the star was believed to be by the Jews at that time a messianic figure, and he roused the remaining Jews in Galilee and Judea to form another insurrection against Rome. This was completely catastrophic, and the Romans went in again, killed a significant percentage of the population, and more or less sent the rest of them, what remained of them, out into exile. So that's why at a certain point there were no longer basically any Jews living in the land that we now call Israel because of that. But they weren't just dispersed into Europe. Many of them were dispersed into the east, into what is now what were then sort of Babylon and Persia, well, not Babylonian and Persian empires, but the regions. So today there are lots of Jews, or there were until not so long ago, lots of Jews living in Iran and Iraq. Just as we've had Jews living in Europe for thousands of years, there have also been Jews living in Iran and Iraq for thousands of years. But not really anymore, because sadly, over the last few decades since the Mullah regime took over in Iran, is that what they're called? You know that? Yeah. When was the Iranian kingdom, the Shah over for? So yeah, since that happened, the Jews were persecuted. Yeah. And then in Iraq, it was even worse. Saddam Hussein, extremely anti-Semitic, evil man, trying to murder lots of Jews as well. So lots of Jews from Iran and Iraq actually found safety in the state of Israel. And so, yes, they're not just from Europe, they're also from the East as well. Are people still with me? Any questions?
Well, just the reflection is that the world hasn't changed much, sadly.
It hasn't changed at all. No, humanity is humanity. What remaining Jews, very few were left in Palestine, eventually went because the Romans basically had it out for the Jews and made life a living hell for them by heavily taxing them and taking away their land and everything. So the Jews had no choice but to basically leave that land altogether. Yes?
I'm thinking about the Romans picked on them because they were monotheistic.
Yeah.
What about, when was, sorry, Islam hadn't happened yet?
No.
Okay.
Okay, yeah. We'll get onto that, don't worry. Yeah. I feel like I'm bombarding you. Is this too much?
No,
Like,
no,
are you
no,
sure?
no,
Okay.
that's
So basically, so the Roman Empire continued as a united empire until Constantine. Constantine switched the capital from Rome to Constantinople in 321 BC AD, I want to say, and Constantinople is there. Then the empire became divided in two after his sons. So there was the Eastern Roman Empire and the Western Roman Empire. Christianity obviously expanded massively at this point throughout, and the 4th century, the 300s, is kind of the point at which Rome ceases to be pagan and becomes Christian. And there are lots of Jews living among them as well. Initially, Jews actually lived quite okay alongside Christians. It wasn't really until the sort of 5th and 6th century that problems started to happen. The Western Roman Empire eventually disintegrates. The power base, Rome, becomes weaker and weaker and weaker. And the sort of the northern tribes, the Goths and the Visigoths and all the other kind of so-called barbarian tribes, they invade all the Roman territory until the Western Roman Empire is literally just what is modern day Italy. And the last Roman emperor, Romulus, is overthrown in about 480 AD. But the Eastern Roman Empire, which we call the Byzantine or the Byzantine Empire, remains very powerful for another 1,000 years. And their capital is Constantinople. So Jerusalem and Judea, or it's not called that anymore, so we'll just call it Palestine just for the sake of ease, was part of the Eastern Roman Empire. It's worth noting that although we call it the Byzantine Empire, and although they were predominantly Greek, they didn't call themselves Byzantines, they still called themselves Romans. They regarded themselves as the Eastern Roman Empire. So although they weren't Latin, they were Greek, they still called themselves Roman. So they continued to rule all this region, as well as the lands up here, for another 100 years or so. And then someone very influential was born in the year 570 AD. Can we guess who that is?
Jesus.
No. Muhammad. Muhammad was born. And Muhammad grew up in Arabia, down here, and he began having visions of the angel Gabriel in a cave, imparting to him words which he wrote down in these surahs, which eventually compiled together to be called the Quran. And the new religion under his position as prophet began in the city of Mecca. Eventually he was ousted out of Mecca into Medina. And then in Medina, the religion continued to grow and grow. Eventually Muhammad died, and Islam spread very, very rapidly throughout all this region, Northern Africa, the Near East, Middle East, all that kind of area. And eventually the Arab conquests, as they were called back then, of Islam, took all this land from the Eastern Empire, the Byzantine Empire. So a lot of the Byzantine territories fell to those early Arab conquests when Islam was just beginning. So it was in 638, I think, that the Islamic forces conquered Jerusalem. And so Palestine, for the next few hundred years, was ruled by various Arab caliphs. And that was where many Arab people started to live in this region. So most present-day Palestinians are descended from those Arabs that started to live there, to move there in the 7th century AD. So hardly any Jews there, but lots of Arabs living there now. And this continued. The various caliphates ruled what is now the land of Palestine until the Turks took over in 1071. Huh?
The Ottoman Empire.
The Ottoman, not quite yet, yeah, but they were just called the Turks then. And then that was in 1071. And then, although the Christian Eastern Roman Empire was quite happy to just sort of, which was Orthodox Christian, was quite happy to just sort of let things be. The Western Roman Empire, which was Roman Catholic, was not happy at all to have Arabs living in Jerusalem and the place of Jesus. So what then started happening? The Crusades. The Crusades began in the 11th century. It was the French that started it.
It's almost the way.
And they conquered Jerusalem and established the Kingdom of Jerusalem, also known as the Latin Kingdom, which was a bit of a kind of pointless enterprise, really. So lots of Christians, crusaders came on pilgrimages to live there. That was created in 1099. And this lasted for not very long, because eventually a very powerful Arab conqueror called Sultan called Salah ad-Din, he reclaimed Jerusalem from the French kings, from that Latin kingdom, and Jerusalem, that land became Arab Muslim again. The Crusades still continued for another 100 years. We came along the English, Richard III, that failed, and then more Crusades after that, and it continued until the Mamluks took over that land. The Mamluks were another Arabic dynasty, and they ruled for another few hundred years until, you said it earlier, the Ottoman Empire. So in the 1400s, the Byzantine Empire, so the Roman Empire still lasted until the 1400s. People don't realize that. That's how long, like, vestiges of the Roman Empire lasted until.
Daniel, you said Richard III, did you mean Richard I? Or did you say
Sorry, Richard I, yeah, Richard Lionheart, yeah. Not Richard III, no, he wasn't quite as cool as that. So the Ottoman Empire, the Turks eventually, it feels terrible calling them the Turks, doesn't it? It sounds really racist. So eventually Constantinople falls in the 1400s. It's invaded by Muslim groups from there, and this area. So it's not the whole of the Byzantine Empire that falls. It's just this area around sort of here, and that becomes the newly created Ottoman Empire. And Christian Orthodoxy is allowed to continue in Constantinople, which is now called Istanbul, but under sort of Muslim rule. And the main sort of carrier of Orthodoxy is now the Russian Tsar further to the north, and the Christianity of the East continues in Greece and Russia and Eastern Europe. But yes, the Ottoman Empire rules all this region, including the Palestine, and it rules all of that land until 1917. So, and that's where we come to the kind of what we're trying to talk about. So that was a long run through of the history of this. Do people manage to follow that? Okay. What time are we on? Do people want to finish now, or I can go over into the beginnings of the conflict? It's up to you.
Because we got as far as the Ottomans in 1917.
Yes?
It seems a pity to stop now, but other people may have a different.
What do people think?
Carry
Happy to keep going?
Yeah.
What do you think, Margaret? What are you going to say? Carry on. Okay. So, Europe, 19th century, the most powerful it's ever been. So there are all these great powers, as they're called, that rule Europe. So the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the British Empire, the French Empire, and all of the various kingdoms. And they all have colonies all around the world. And we think that we're, this great sort of Christian utopian empire, in that where it's God's destiny for us to kind of take over the world, blah, blah, blah. But while this is all happening, for hundreds of years, ever since those initial dispersions, 2,000 years ago, Jews have been living alongside us in Europe. So there were millions of Jews in Europe at that time, 10 million Jews living in Europe, mostly in Eastern Europe, but also still quite a lot in Germany and France, and to a lesser degree, even in England as well. And the Jews living in Europe are quite understandably sick and tired of European Christian anti-Semitism. They're sick of being treated as citizens, as pariahs. So a gentleman from Germany called Theodor Herzl convenes the first Zionist Congress in 1897 in Switzerland. And there are over 200 Jewish delegates that meet him there in Basel in Switzerland, and mostly from Eastern Europe. And they talk about how they want to create a Jewish nation state. They believe that wherever we go in the world, we're being poorly treated, people are prejudiced against people, haters. We want to find an area of land that we can call our own, where we can live in peace and safety, practice our religion, practice our Jewish values and cultures without being attacked from the outside. Zionism today is quite a dirty word. However, the original definition of Zionism, it's important to remember, is simply the creation of a home for the Jewish people. That's all Zionism is. It's nothing more than that. So the most obvious place, there was some talk of getting the British Empire to give them a piece of Eastern Africa to live, but most Jews didn't want to do that. So the most logical place was Palestine, because obviously that's in the Bible, it's very important to them, it's their history, it's where their ancient ancestors came from and everything. So they want to create a Jewish nation state in Palestine. Their slogan was, at the time, a land without a people for a people without a land. However, there were people living there. Very underpopulated, but still people living there. So Palestine at that time wasn't called Palestine, it's worth mentioning. It was a backwater region of the Ottoman Empire. It was very poor, it was very badly policed and managed. The Ottoman Empire was starting to disintegrate at its fringes. There was no infrastructure, there was no civil service, there was no police, there was nothing, it was basically anarchy. And the Arab peoples living there, again, worth noting, they did not call themselves Palestinians, it's a recent thing. So the Arab peoples living there in the region that we now call Palestine, they mostly lived in the hill country. I'm just going to see if I've got a map of more detailed map of Israel on here somewhere. Probably don't. Here we go. Ignore the sort of the ancient kingdoms for a minute. Palestine has a very interesting geography. So all along the coastal regions are very fertile plains, lots of soils, really, really good climate, rainfall, good for growing wheat, maize, barley, all that kind of thing. Along the Jordan River, that's the fault line, is a desert. And this is around here where Jerusalem and Bethlehem are, and all this, that's the Judean hill country. So in the Bible times, Jews mostly lived in the hill country in this region. They didn't really live along the plain. However, I'll call them Palestinians. Most of the Palestinians at that time, they lived in the hill country region, not along the plain, because they didn't have particularly sophisticated agricultural techniques, so there was no way they could really export all of their anything they could grow. The main thing they exported actually was oranges. So Jaffa was where the Palestinians grew what were described as the best oranges in the world. They imported them to Europe. But the problem they had was because this backwater area of the Ottoman Empire was so badly managed and policed, they were constantly under threat from Bedouin bandits and tribes that would attack them. So they had no choice but to leave the plains and to live in the hill country where they were safer. So the European Jewish Zionists said, well, look, it's hardly one living in the coastal plains, so why don't we just move over to there? Yes.
What would be the rough date you're talking about?
Sorry, this is the 1890s.
1890.
1890s, yeah.
So were there any Jews living there? Because
Not really, no.
about 10%, wasn't it? Something like that.
At that time,
Yeah.
there were 30,000 Jews living there at that time. Yes, there were Jews living there at that time, but not in any kind of large
This is
communities.
1890s.
1890s, yeah. But it was mostly Arab peoples that lived there. And some of the Jews, however, were not happy about Zionism. It's worth mentioning that. So one particular Jewish man called Ahad Haham, he said, it is difficult to find fields that are not sowed. If a time comes when our people in Palestine develop so that in small or great measure, they push out the native inhabitants, these will not give up their place easily. How right he was. So they agreed on Zionism in Switzerland. They thought, well, we can start, and they did from the 1890s onwards. Jewish people in Europe started arriving in dribs and drabs onto the coastal plain, and they started establishing all over it their little farming communities. Initially, they worked quite well with the Palestinians. They sort of traded with them, they worked with them, they had a shared economy and a society. It was all kind of fine. But over time that changed. So although they agreed on Zionism in that conference in Switzerland, they couldn't agree what type of Zionism they wanted it to be. So there are two types of Zionism. There's labor Zionism and political Zionism. So Herzl, he advocated political Zionism, which is where he wanted to work with the great powers of Europe, particularly the Sultan and the Russian Tsar, in helping him get diplomatic agreements to bring their Jewish populations over to Palestine and then form their Jewish state with their own government and everything like that. However, this wasn't very popular because a lot of the Jews felt this would be just too intrusive, that people would never accept it. So labor Zionism eventually won over. It's worth mentioning, none of this was religious. It wasn't religious at all. The fact that they lived here and not in the hill country of their ancestors, it kind of showed that they weren't really interested in sort of going to those holy places of their ancestry. They just wanted a place to stay and be safe. That was what it was. There was no kind of big Jewish religious revival. It was basically secular Judaism wanting to find a region to call home. Labor Zionism was agricultural, so that was where Jews began arriving and forming kibbutzes, Jewish communities all along the plain were very sort of self-contained and run independently. So Herzl died in 1904 before he could sort of realize his ideas. By 1914, however, tens of thousands of Jews had already moved over. So there were about sort of 85,000 Jews had emigrated to Palestine by 1914. And though their conditions were at first very impoverished, they gradually managed to establish very livable agrarian communities, kibbutzes. And as I said earlier, at first they worked very well with their Palestinian neighbors. After a while, they decided, actually, we want to have our own economy, our own society, and solidly Jewish identity and communities. They began to live in separate communities away from the Palestinians. But the Palestinians did not just live in the hill country anymore by this point. Many of them had begun to see how it was now safer here than before, and that the farming and agricultural opportunities offered them a more livable lifestyle. So they began to move onto the coastal plain where a lot of the Jewish populations were already living, and that's obviously where the problems started. The real sort of progenitor of this first Israeli nation was, you probably heard of him, he's called Daniel Ben-Gurion. So he was also a late 19th century Jewish politician who really kind of pushed for the idea of labor Zionism, which is these, as I said, these agrarian communities living on the coastal plain of Israel.
What was happening to Jerusalem next?
Jerusalem, Ben Gurion, he didn't visit Jerusalem until 3 years after he moved to Israel. And that just kind of shows you how uninterested they were in Jerusalem. There was no interest in it at all. So when I say it wasn't a religious kind of revival, that really, really do mean that. Like they established Tel Aviv, where Jaffa is, that became their main city. But hardly any Jews went over to Jerusalem. They weren't interested in it. And Jerusalem was kind of a ruin basically by that point. It wasn't a very livable place at all. Yes, and then the Ottomans were kind of they let them move in because they didn't really have much control over that area, but they let the Jews continue to move in and begin to establish all their communities. But they had no opportunity at this point to form their own nation state like they wanted to, because the Ottoman Empire still existed. But then, of course, what happened in 1914? First World War, which lasted for 5 years. By the end of the First World War, the whole map of Europe was redrawn. All those empires, Russia, Ottoman Empire, Germany, Austria-Hungary, they all fell. And who took over Palestine? We did. So in 1917, all the various, so actually it wasn't just one province. This in the Ottoman Empire, this was lots of different provinces. But it all became one thing under Britain. So Britain controlled Palestine and Jordan. It was called the Transjordan. Jordan gained independence not long after that. And then we controlled Palestine, which was at that time called the British Mandate. And that allowed a new opportunity for Jews to think about creating their own nation state. It would be a while before they actually did that. But at that time, the British government was very kind of pro the idea of Jews forming their own nation. So Britain, probably more than any other country, was instrumental in creating the modern Israeli nation state as we know it. But we still understood that the Palestinians were not going to be happy about this, and that, you know, all this had to come and be reckoned with. But by this point, there were nearly 100,000 Jews now living in Palestine, alongside the hundreds of thousands of other Arabs living there as well. And it's worth remembering that the Palestinians are not all Muslims. There were lots of Christian Palestinians as well. So all three Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, were now living once again side by side in the Holy Land. And so we've reached 1917. That's where I'm going to stop. So part one. Thank you. Any questions?
How did you remember all of that without barely any notes?
Amazing. Haven't done
I had a question.
Yes.
I was really intrigued that just how I'd never realised how secular it was. I assumed it was a religious movement.
Yeah.
And the fact that it was totally secular and they were in fertile south. Now I realise I'm now going to ask two questions.
Yeah.
Is the fertile south sort of Galilee, or is Galilee a different bit?
No. So it's not the fertile south. So the coastal plain. So it's north to south in the west of the country. That's where they were living mostly. Galilee's up here.
Yeah.
Galilee's so the hill country is here.
Yeah.
Galilee is up there where the Sea of Galilee is,
Right.
as you know. Again, I don't think there was any interest in. So Galilee, oh gosh, this part of Galilee would have been part of the Kingdom of Jordan at that point. This part here would have been another Ottoman. No one was talking about. No, this would have been all an Ottoman province, and then that would have, after Jordan gained independence, that part of Galilee would have been the Kingdom of Jordan, and that part would have been British Palestine after World War I. But no, they lived along the coastal plain. Galilee is it's very high up. So the topography of the country is really weird. So it's all flat along here, and then it rises up here, and then it goes down again. It's all flat because although Upper Galilee is very high, about Hermon and the Golan Heights, Lower Galilee, Sea of Galilee, is one of the lowest points in the world. It's 200 meters below sea level. Dead Sea is the lowest point on the planet. That's something like 400 meters below sea level. It's absolutely boiling. Yeah, but this is all just a desert in between. And although the hill country does have sort of greenery, it's not a particularly livable place. But yes, it began very secular. So both types of Zionism initially, the political and the labor Zionism, were very secular, but it became a lot more religious eventually. Hence why we have lots of Jewish settlements today in the West Bank. So the hill country today is what is now the West Bank. And the reason why there are a lot of Israeli settlements in the West Bank, which is against international law, is because that's the place of their ancestors. They want to be where the religious sites are. So so Zionism became a lot more religious, a lot more right-wing, a lot more nationalistic. But originally, Zionism wasn't like that at all. So it's just worth, if you're going to take one thing away from this, Zionism today is a very dirty word, but all it was originally was just wanting to find a home for the Jewish people where they could live in peace and safety. And I don't personally think there's anything wrong with that. I don't agree with the kind of Zionism we have now under Netanyahu. I think it's evil, but originally that was not what the plan and the vision was. But we will look more into that over the next couple of weeks. So we'll go into much more depth now. So we've covered 4,000 years of history. Next week we'll cover 100 years.
At the time of the land,
Yes.
where exactly were the borders?
Gosh, yeah.
Because I'm sure it's outside Israel, isn't it? As we know.
Yeah, it was Jordan as well.
Going to Jordan.
It was Jordan, yeah. It was trans-Jordan. So it was what today is the state of Israel and Jordan. That was the whole region. But the Hassanite Kingdom of Jordan gained independence in, I want to say, 1925, and then but Britain still controlled Palestine. The borders wouldn't have been exactly the same as they are today, I don't think. Not least because Israel took chunks from Syria after the 6 Day War. We'll go into that next week. Leslie, you had a question.
Yeah, so when Israelites started moving into the area that was rather sparsely but still populated by Arabs,
Yeah.
they didn't have any aspiration to get rid of those Arabs. They regarded the land that they were claiming as being a land that was occupied by other people.
It's a very good question. It's difficult. I don't think there was ever any intention of creating a mass displacement of Arab peoples. I don't think that was their plan originally at all. It did happen, and we'll go into that. But I think initially it was just we wanted to build our own communities in this sparsely populated land that has some connection with our ancestry. And sorry, I forgot to mention there were two waves of immigration. There was the first wave of immigration in the 1890s, and that was when the Jews that moved there worked alongside Palestinians and traded with them and worked with them. And then the second wave, the Ben Gurion wave, that was more exclusive, where they lived in their own settlements and wanted their own economies and societies completely separate from the native Arabs. That's when the problem started. So it might have become more like that as this First World War approached. But we'll look into that more next week. Yeah. Any other questions?
Was the becoming more trying to cling to their Jewish, I don't mean to be clean, trying to express their Jewish identity rather than their Jewry.
Yeah.
Was that at all linked to becoming more faith-based, or was it still just wanting to have an expression of Jewish identity that was secular Jews?
I don't think it was a revival of faith necessarily at all. I mean, there are lots of Jewish atheists and agnostics who still love going to synagogue and having their kids do their bar mitzvahs and stuff like that because it's part of their shared heritage and culture and everything. And God doesn't necessarily come into it for a lot of them. And I think it was probably the same then in many respects. But some of them it would have been a religious thing. But Ben Gurion, he wasn't religious at all. He was an atheist. So yeah.
He was culturally Jewish.
Culturally Jewish. It was a culturally Jewish thing. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Someone
Yes,
like
Kathy, yeah.
a Jewish friend of mine who told me about the British Mandate said that, and I might have got this misunderstood, but at that time of 1917, maybe, Britain decided that Israel could be for the Jews and Jordan could be for the.
Yeah, I think that was a plan at one point, just to kick them all onto the other side of the river. Yeah, but that didn't last very long. I didn't know. I'll have to look that up for you, but I think there is some truth in that. Yeah, yeah. And a lot of Palestinians obviously did go to Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Egypt, the surrounding countries.
Well, France had Lebanon, didn't they?
Yeah, they did. Yes, it was part of the French Empire. Do you know what country, by the way, has most Palestinian asylum seekers? Yeah, not Britain. No. It's Canada.
Okay.
Canada has tens and tens of thousands of Palestinian asylum seekers. It takes in all the Palestinians. Yeah, just a bit of trivia. Okay, I'll leave it there. You want to go home to bed? I want to go to bed.
We should keep-
Yeah, thank you.